Ever cut someone off and never looked back? Right, I did, if so.
For a year straight, week after week without a single pause, I transferred $600 from my paycheck into my parents' account, convincing myself it was the right thing to do, that they needed me, that family loyalty mattered more than my own comfort. I told myself that the dent it left in my budget was just temporary, that eventually they would look at me not only as their daughter, but as someone reliable, someone they could finally be proud of. Yet when summer rolled around and the family vacation was announced with excitement spilling over group messages and phone calls, I learned there was no ticket with my name on it. No room booked for me, no seat in the van, no mention of my presence. And when I asked directly, trying to keep the disbelief out of my voice, my father looked at me with the kind of coldness that burns hotter than anger and said the words that made my stomach drop. "We didn't want you there." The sting was immediate, like someone had reached into my chest and slammed the door on me from the inside. It wasn't even about the vacation itself. God knows I wasn't desperate to roast in Florida heat beside my brother Jason while he bragged about nothing and flirted with waitresses like some washed-up high school quarterback. No, it was about the truth those words carried. I had been good enough to subsidize their bills, cover prescriptions, and pay for Jason's broken-down car repairs when he cried about needing help to get back on his feet. But I wasn't good enough to sit at the same dinner table, order from the same menu, or be part of the slideshow of family photos destined for Facebook captions about blessed time together. I stood there with the silence stretching, realizing my mother wasn't going to step in, wasn't going to soften the blow or offer a lifeline. She stood behind my father with her arms folded, her eyes darting away from mine like she couldn't bear the sight of me, or maybe couldn't bear her own guilt. My voice cracked when I asked why, and his response was clipped, final, like a judge slamming a gavel, "Because this was for us, and you're too much drama." I should have yelled, should have demanded every penny back, should have reminded them that their air conditioning stayed on last summer because of me, that their fridge was full when Dad's hours got cut because I didn't hesitate to transfer extra. Instead, I nodded like some obedient little soldier, my face frozen in place, my body shaking under the weight of holding back the scream sitting in my chest. I walked out with my keys clenched in my palms so tightly they left marks on my skin, and I drove until the city lights faded and the interstate stretched into black nothingness. I replayed that sentence, "We didn't want you there," over and over until it became less of a statement and more of a verdict, proof that no matter what I sacrificed, in their eyes I would never be chosen. But here's the thing about me, the part they always underestimated. I don't shout, I don't beg, I don't throw plates against the wall when someone tries to humiliate me. I stay quiet, I store it all away, and then I wait. Because silence, when it's deliberate, is sharper than rage. And as I sat in that car, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles went white, I felt the shift inside me. They thought I would crumble, that I would swallow the rejection like I had swallowed every snub before. Instead, I promised myself right there, under the dark sky and the hum of the highway, that I would make sure this moment wasn't forgotten. The drive turned into a blur of headlights and gas stations, but my mind was crystal clear. I thought about every wire transfer I'd made, every "thank you, sweetie" text from Mom that felt hollow, every time Jason laughed off responsibility because he knew someone, me, would catch him before he hit the ground. I thought about my own apartment with its peeling paint and secondhand couch, the way I skipped dinners out with friends because I had to budget around their needs, how I kept telling myself that one day they would appreciate me. That day would never come, and accepting that truth was both painful and strangely liberating. When I finally parked outside my building and sat in the silence, the anger settled into something harder, something steadier. They had cut me out with a single sentence, but in doing so, they had handed me something stronger than their approval: clarity. I didn't need to wonder anymore if I was imagining their favoritism, if I was being dramatic, if I was holding on to grudges from childhood. They had spelled it out in words I couldn't misinterpret. And if they believed excluding me would keep their little family picture perfect, they had no idea that the person they pushed aside was the only one holding the pieces together. I walked into my apartment that night without turning on the lights, collapsed onto the couch, and let myself laugh, a bitter, broken laugh that echoed in the dark. They didn't want me there. Fine. But if I wasn't wanted, then I was free. And freedom, I realized, could be dangerous in the hands of someone like me. Because once I stop paying, once I stop carrying, once I stop pretending I don't see the cracks in their perfect little world, those cracks will spread. And when they do, I'll be standing on the other side, watching every piece fall exactly where it should. That night, I drafted my first plan. Nothing dramatic, nothing messy. Just a quiet decision. I would stop being their lifeline. They would feel the absence, slowly at first, like a light bulb flickering, and then all at once, like a house going dark. And the best part? They wouldn't even realize it was deliberate until it was far too late. I closed my eyes and let the exhaustion drag me under, but the promise stayed alive, pulsing under my skin. If they didn't want me there, then I would make damn sure they remembered what life was like without me. The morning after I decided to stop being their silent sponsor, I sat at my kitchen table with a secondhand laptop, a chipped mug, and the kind of patience you grow only after you have been told to your face that you are not wanted. And I began building something my family had never expected from me, which was a paper trail so neat, so boring, and so lethal in the right hands that it felt almost elegant. I opened my banking app and exported a year of transfers, then combed through each line until the rhythm of it became a song I could hum. 600 here, 600 there, an extra 100 when Dad mentioned the pharmacy. A few more when Mom hinted at the electric bill. Little kindnesses that, stacked together, had the mass of a small car. I dropped the files into a folder I named with the blandest label imaginable, records, because bland names do not scare people until the moment you open them, and then they do not stop thinking about them for weeks. I pulled our old group messages and scrolled until my thumbnail throbbed, noting the pattern that had always felt like fog but now sat crisp as print. Requests arriving on Thursday night with a soft apology, we hate to ask, followed by a story about Jason's job search or a bill that arrived early, then my transfer on Friday morning, followed, almost comically, by a weekend photo of my parents eating somewhere they always called a treat we never do, and Jason grinning with a beer like the closing credits of a sitcom that never gets canceled. I am not jealous by nature, but jealousy is a strange word for the feeling that shows up when you realize you have been underwriting someone else's fun while clipping coupons for your own groceries, and if there is humor buried in that mess, it is dry and brittle. The kind you laugh at because the alternative is punching drywall. The first small revenge was not glamorous, yet it landed with the kind of thud you can hear across state lines. I had been the guarantor on their internet and power after Dad's credit score tripped over itself last winter, so I called each company, provided the polite script about account closure due to relocation, and scheduled the transfer of responsibility to the actual occupants of the house on the exact Monday they were due to fly out for their Sandy family togetherness, which I found satisfyingly poetic. There was nothing illegal and nothing cruel, only the clean sound of responsibility returning to where it should have stayed. And I even left them a printed envelope on the kitchen counter during a drop-in visit with account numbers and the customer service lines highlighted, because spite tastes better when you serve it with plausible deniability and a whisper of helpfulness. Next, I ordered a prepaid debit card in my mother's name with a small balance, activated it, and tucked it into a carefully worded Mother's Day card that I had left intentionally late on the hall table, the kind of gentle apology card that says, "Use this just for yourself," accompanied by a note explaining that the card would send me automated alerts for fraud protection, a sentence that sounds like boring banking language until you realize it is also a neon sign for patterns. I did not write that last part, of course. I simply registered for the alerts and waited, because waiting, when done properly, is not inaction but strategy. In the quiet stretches of that week, I made a ledger like a patient accountant, listing every for the pharmacy transfer and every the fridge is empty plea, then matched those dates against the time-stamped photos my mother loves to post. A catalog of brunch plates and sunset cocktails that tell the truth even when the captions insist otherwise, and the alignments were so precise that I did not need a conspiracy board or red string. I only needed a calculator and the knowledge that restaurants do not accept gratitude as payment. I called my brother under the pretext of asking whether he had found work yet and listened to him give me the familiar speech about interviews that were so close, then let him ramble long enough to tell me, without realizing it, the exact dates they planned to travel and which hotel he had persuaded them to book because the pool is nicer, a detail that is both trivial and wildly revealing when you hold a year of transfers in your hand like a ledger of choices. Mom texted twice that week with cheery updates about packing lists, and I responded with warmth so mild it could have been mistaken for a shrug, then turned back to my folder and added screenshots of those messages to the tidy pile, because their words, when placed next to numbers, become something heavier than either alone. I also called the pharmacy myself and removed my card from file with the same calm I used to organize a drawer, a small act that made my spine straighten, not because anyone would suffer without notice, but because grown adults can make calls and set up their own autopay if they want the medication, and if they do not, then we have all learned something we should have known. On Sunday night, the house went still, the suitcases rolled out, and a text arrived from Mom with a photo of a packed trunk and a caption that used the word blessed in a way that made me swallow a laugh. And I put the phone face down and waited for the automated emails I had scheduled to ping their inboxes. Confirmations that the utility accounts would transfer at the start of business Monday, and that any interruption would be resolved upon completion of new account setup, which is corporate. Speak for, call us when you get home, and do not forget your routing number. I slept well for the first time in months, not because I am cruel, but because breathing comes easier when you set something heavy down and walk away. The next morning, 2 alerts landed on my phone within minutes of one another. Nita's train arrivals. The prepaid card had been used at an airport ATM for a withdrawal just under the daily limit. And a second charge appeared almost immediately at a beachside hotel with a lounge that my mother once described as too fancy for us, but maybe someday, and I stared at the screen until my coffee cooled, realizing that someday had a date, and it was today. Funded by a card meant for quiet kindness. I did not call, I did not text, I did not perform hurt. I only saved the alerts to the folder and let the silence do what it does best, which is teach. By noon, Dad sent a message half sugar and half reprimand, asking whether I had messed with the accounts because now the internet is being weird, and I answered with a line so even it felt like glass, explaining that everything had been moved into their names for simplicity and that the providers were ready to assist upon their return. Then I placed my phone face down again and smiled at the ceiling with a kind of tired, satisfied relief that felt almost like rest. The second small revenge had landed, not cruel, not loud, only fair, and it set the table for the next course without me lifting another finger. At dusk, while the sky turned the color of watered-down wine, my email chimed with a subject line from my company that I read 3 times before it fully took shape. A concise invitation to discuss a role I had once considered out of reach, and I understood. With a steadiness that surprised me, that timing is not magic, but a ledger closing with the numbers finally aligned, and as I clicked it open, my phone lit up again with an unknown number tied to the hotel where my parents were checking in. And I let it ring until the room went quiet, because whatever they needed now would have to wait. The following week unfolded in a rhythm that was both deliberate and quiet, a cadence I had not experienced before because it was built entirely on observation, patience, and the knowledge that absence, when wielded with precision, has a weight far heavier than presence. I did not call, I did not send money, and I did not respond to their increasingly frantic texts, which shifted from polite inquiries into subtle guilt trips and then into outright panic. A progression that I had anticipated, but still found astonishing in its intensity. Each message from my mother, once gentle and carefully phrased, now carried a sharp edge of desperation, as if her carefully constructed life had been relying on the invisible scaffolding of my generosity, and now that scaffolding had quietly disappeared, leaving the structure wobbling dangerously. My brother Jason, predictably, called multiple times a day, each conversation longer than the last, filled with excuses about why he hadn't secured a job, why his car broke down again, and why they simply had to have my help because, without it, nothing works, and I let him talk, meticulously taking notes in my head about every word, every contradiction. Every desperate appeal to a daughter who had apparently become both the bank and the conscience of a household too comfortable with indulgence. I began spending hours each evening cross-referencing the new messages with my ledger of bank transfers and the receipts I had diligently archived over the past year, tracing a web of dependency that was at once infuriating and fascinating, because I realized that their entire household operated on a system of silent compacts and assumptions in which I had been the only participant fully aware of the terms, and now, by stepping away, I had thrown the system into chaos without uttering a single word of accusation or anger. I found myself marveling at the ease with which they had relied on me without acknowledgement, at the audacity of my father's earlier dismissal, at the way my mother had followed him without question, and at Jason's obliviousness to the world outside of his immediate desires. And yet, amidst the frustration, a certain clarity emerged. I was no longer complicit, and the consequences of their choices would now unfold according to their own inability to manage what they had so recklessly taken for granted. Midweek, I received a frantic voicemail from my mother, pleading in a tone that oscillated between apology and panic, begging me to explain why the utility bills had not been paid automatically, why the grocery delivery had been missed, and why the internet and cable were now offline at the very moment she wanted to stream her favorite show while sipping iced tea in the Florida heat. I did not return the call immediately, because returning the call would have been yielding the leverage I now held, a leverage carefully cultivated over weeks of strategic absence, and instead, I documented the voicemail, transcribed every word, and added it to the growing folder I had created, a digital archive that transformed emotional desperation into tangible evidence of dependency and entitlement. Every time I heard the tremor in her voice, I could feel the same tremor reverberating through my own sense of empowerment, a quiet satisfaction that I had not anticipated when I first decided to stop sending money, because it was one thing to remove myself from their financial lifeline, but it was an entirely different experience to witness them floundering and to know that the source of the disruption was my deliberate choice. By Thursday evening, the intensity had escalated. Jason had sent 3 lengthy emails, each more convoluted than the last, explaining in minute detail the failures of the vacation planning, the shortcomings of hotel staff, and the absolute necessity of my immediate intervention. I allowed myself a small, ironic smile, thinking how he never realized that the very accounts he assumed were backing his indulgences were now out of reach, and that every complaint he forwarded to me had no impact other than to reinforce the ledger of his own carelessness. I spent that night preparing my subtle escalation, crafting emails and scheduled alerts that would ensure my parents' awareness of the disruption without requiring me to speak directly. Leveraging the technology and documentation I had collected with meticulous care, a strategy that was patient, precise, and inevitable in its effect. The week culminated in a single, calculated act. I logged into the utility and service accounts I had originally managed on their behalf, verified the scheduled transfers had been redirected into their names, and set up automated notifications designed to alert them of any discrepancy, knowing full well that the moment they attempted to pay or adjust anything, they would be confronted with a reality they had never anticipated. I sat back in my chair and allowed the silence to settle over my apartment, the hum of the ceiling fan a backdrop to the quiet victory I felt, because the chaos I had orchestrated required no confrontation, no argument, and no dramatics, only the patient alignment of cause and consequence. Late that evening, I received a single text from my father, terse and disbelieving. "Emily, this is unacceptable. Call us immediately." I did not answer. I let it sit, unread, the screen facing down on the table as though the phone itself were complicit in the pause, and in that moment, I realized that the power of absence was not merely in withdrawal, but in anticipation, and that every desperate call, every frantic message, and every unheeded plea now carried a weight far greater than any words I could have uttered. I smiled quietly to myself, understanding fully that the most devastating effect of my decision was not the chaos itself, but the realization slowly dawning on them that they could no longer assume my presence, that the invisible scaffolding had been removed, and that for the first time in decades, they were left to face the consequences of their own neglect. The day began with an unusual sense of anticipation, not the frantic, clawing kind that had dominated the past weeks, but a quiet, deliberate awareness that the next move I made would carry consequences far beyond the immediate inconvenience I had already orchestrated. And as I sipped my coffee and reviewed the folder I had meticulously assembled over months of careful observation, I realized that patience, combined with careful timing, had transformed what had begun as frustration into an almost surgical precision in which every transfer, every archived text, every voicemail, and every carefully scheduled alert became a tool of accountability that could be wielded with a cold clarity my family had never imagined. A clarity that would expose not only their neglect, but their preference for a son who had consistently taken advantage of their leniency, while I had quietly carried responsibilities that were never recognized. I had spent years silently supporting them, sending money weekly with the hope that it was appreciated and that my presence in their lives mattered, and yet I now understood that my value to them had always been transactional, measured in dollars and convenience rather than love or gratitude, and as the realization settled over me, it crystallized into a strategy that was both subtle and devastating, because it required no shouting, no confrontation, and no immediate gratification, only the slow, inexorable accumulation of consequences that they would be forced to acknowledge when they were least prepared to do so. I began by reviewing the emails and notifications from my company, noting an opportunity one had previously overlooked, a promotion that required nothing more than a formal application and a brief discussion with my supervisor. And I recognized that this was the perfect alignment of timing and opportunity, that my own advancement could serve as both personal achievement and the ultimate demonstration of independence from a family that had long relied upon me without reciprocation. By mid-morning, I had drafted a carefully worded email to the dean of my online program, a professional yet warm message outlining my upcoming graduation and requesting the ceremonial recognition that had always been offered to students who had maintained both consistent performance and financial responsibility. And I included a subtle note that my family had been aware of the support I had provided for their needs while pursuing my degree, a detail that, when revealed, would carry the weight of both pride and discomfort, because it documented the juxtaposition between their reliance upon me and their recent rejection. I scheduled the email to be sent at the exact moment when my parents would likely be enjoying the first breakfast of their vacation, a time when their attention was divided and their assumptions were unchallenged. And I allowed myself a quiet satisfaction in knowing that the revelation would reach them at the perfect intersection of timing and impact. Meanwhile, I maintained my usual routines, attending to my work responsibilities with focused diligence while letting my phone remain silent, ignoring calls that displayed my parents' increasing anxiety and my brother's frantic attempts at persuasion. And I marveled at how swiftly the absence of someone who had always been available could destabilize a household that had operated under the illusion of control, because they had assumed that I would always be present, always accommodating, always ready to intervene, and now that assumption had been shattered with the simplicity of deliberate non-engagement. Each alert that appeared on my phone, indicating another inquiry from the hotel or a missed payment notification, reinforced the effectiveness of my strategy, and I felt a measured, quiet triumph in the knowledge that I had acted neither out of malice nor impulsivity, but through careful, patient alignment of cause and consequence, allowing the inevitable results to unfold without the need for dramatics or confrontation. As the afternoon progressed, I reviewed my graduation speech, rehearsing the delivery of a statement that was both celebratory and subtly pointed, emphasizing the perseverance, discipline, and independence that had allowed me to complete my degree despite the distractions and obligations imposed upon me by a family that had undervalued my efforts, and I refined each sentence to convey pride and accomplishment without overt accusation, knowing that the power of demonstration lies not in verbal confrontation but in the quiet, undeniable truth of presence and achievement. I considered the possible reactions of my parents, imagining their discomfort at realizing that the very person they had dismissed and excluded was simultaneously achieving a milestone that symbolized self-sufficiency, integrity, and the fulfillment of potential, a milestone they could neither deny nor diminish without revealing their own failings. By evening, I received a text from my mother, brief and hesitant, asking when I would be home for dinner, a message that revealed both uncertainty and an implicit acknowledgement of my absence, and I chose not to respond. Letting the silence emphasize the shift in power and control, a shift that had been cultivated over weeks of careful observation, documentation, and strategic withdrawal. The day concluded with a quiet awareness that the culmination of months of meticulous planning and patient execution was approaching, that the revelation of my graduation, combined with the documentation of my support and their own misjudgments, would arrive with the force of clarity they had not anticipated, and that the moment of reckoning would not require dramatic confrontation but would instead unfold naturally, guided by the undeniable evidence of their choices and my deliberate absence. A truth they would be compelled to confront whether they were prepared or not. The morning of my graduation arrived with a clarity that seemed almost surreal, as if the months of careful planning, quiet withdrawal, and meticulous documentation had coalesced into a single moment in which every action I had taken converged with perfect timing. And I felt the weight of anticipation press against my chest not as anxiety, but as the concentrated energy of inevitability, knowing that the events about to unfold would strip away the illusions my family had long clung to, revealing truths they had ignored, dismissed, or outright refused to acknowledge, and that this revelation would occur without a single raised voice or dramatic confrontation, yet carry a resonance far more powerful than any argument or plea could have achieved. I dressed with deliberate care, selecting a gown that had been purchased months earlier, not for show but as a silent declaration that my accomplishments were independent of their recognition or support, and as I fastened the cap upon my head, I allowed myself a brief, private smile at the thought of how unexpected this day would feel from the perspective of the people who had so recently deemed me unworthy of participation in something as simple as a family vacation, let alone an achievement earned through persistence, discipline, and self-sufficiency. Arriving at the auditorium, I navigated the familiar corridors with a sense of purpose that contrasted sharply with the nervous energy of my peers. Yet my mind remained focused not on their achievements, but on the subtle orchestration of events I had set in motion. Understanding that the culmination of months of patient strategy was about to manifest in a manner that would be both undeniable and profoundly discomforting for those who had underestimated me, and I felt a curious mixture of satisfaction and restraint, knowing that the most effective revenge, unlike impulse or anger, is precise, deliberate, and carried out with an elegance that amplifies its impact without the need for confrontation. When my name was called to the stage, the applause that erupted was both expected and satisfying, but it was the expressions of my parents, caught mid-conversation in a hushed, distracted corner of the auditorium, that drew my attention most sharply. Revealing a mixture of surprise, discomfort, and the first glimmers of understanding that the person they had chosen to exclude had achieved something far beyond their expectations or comprehension, and I moved with steady, measured steps toward the podium, aware that each movement, each gesture, each pause in my delivery would carry meaning beyond the words themselves, silently asserting the independence, discipline, and quiet power that they had long ignored. Taking the microphone, I spoke in a tone that was calm, deliberate, and imbued with pride, carefully framing my accomplishments in the context of perseverance and self-reliance, while subtly referencing the support I had provided to my family. A fact that was neither boastful nor vindictive but simply undeniable, and I watched as their faces shifted through expressions of guilt, disbelief, and recognition, a sequence of emotions that could not be masked by forced smiles or polite applause, and I allowed the weight of those reactions to underscore the significance of my presence, knowing that the evidence of their dependence, now juxtaposed against my achievement, would resonate more profoundly than any argument I could have voiced in anger. As I concluded the ceremony, the dean personally congratulated me, emphasizing not only the excellence of my academic performance, but also acknowledging the sacrifices and support that had allowed me to pursue this path, A detail that caused my parents' eyes to widen and their composure to falter, revealing the depth of their misjudgment and the extent to which they had taken my presence for granted. And in that moment, I recognized that the long game of absence, patience, and careful documentation had culminated in a revelation that no amount of pleading or explanation could have produced, because it was grounded not in opinion but in fact, and fact, once presented clearly, demands recognition even from those who would prefer to remain blind. By the time the ceremony ended, my phone was buzzing incessantly with calls from my parents, texts from my brother, and notifications from friends and colleagues, yet I remained seated, savoring the quiet authority of choice, knowing that for the first time, they were reaching out not because they had a right to my attention, but because they required it, and that the power dynamic had shifted irreversibly in a manner both subtle and undeniable, forcing them to confront the consequences of years of neglect, favoritism, and entitlement. As I walked out of the auditorium and into the sunlight, the sound of congratulations and laughter swirling around me, I allowed myself a final, reflective thought. The satisfaction of having achieved, endured, and strategically revealed the truth to those who had once dismissed me was profound, yet tempered by the knowledge that justice, even when precise and inevitable, does not erase the complexity of family bonds, the lingering questions of morality, or the ambiguous nature of triumph that carries both empowerment and the quiet weight of what has been revealed, leaving them to navigate the repercussions of their choices while I moved forward, independent, acknowledged, and irrevocably free.